Parents of Reddit, what's the creepiest thing you've ever heard from your child? Story 1. One of my kids came wandering out his bedroom at like 1 a.m. and told me he couldn't sleep because the shadows are angry. Like, thanks, kid. Now that's a thing I'm gonna think about forever. Story 2. I was babysitting my cousin and her bedroom door swung wider open of its own accord. I said, well, that was creepy, and slammed the door shut. She said, hey, why'd you slam the door on Grandma? Our same grandma who died 3 months before she was born. Story 3. My daughter once asked, is today the day the glass breaks? Confused, I said no. 10 minutes later, the living room window shattered from a stray cricket ball. Answer. My brother did something similar once. He was 3-4, woke up crying, a chair is gonna crush mommy. My parents were both confused, but just wrote it off as a bad dream. Less than a week later, my mom was trying to move a chair upstairs, lost her footing, and fell backwards down the stairs. The chair fell with her and, well, crushed her. She managed to escape relatively uninjured, but they were both pretty freaked out for a while after that. Story 4. Not a parent, but my nephew is at the stage where everyone who looks remotely like my brother is Dada. My brother is tall with light brown hair, so there are a lot of guys out there who look like him to the lil guy. It always cracks my ill, and I up when we go to the store, and he's pointing around at everyone saying, Dada. A few weeks ago, I was watching him for a few hours while his parents were at an event, and I was getting him settled in his crib, tucked into his sleep sack. Just as I straightened up, his eyeline went from my face to somewhere above my shoulder, like he was looking at someone tall standing behind me, and he smiled and went, Dada. I whipped around so fast and there was no one there, but it scared the absolute shoot out of me, LMAO. Story 5. Not my child, but much older than my sister. One day, when she was about 4 or 5 years old, we were playing in her room. She stopped mid-sentence and stared out her window. She looked scared for a second and then just annoyed. I don't see anything weird, so I asked her what was wrong, and we have the following conversation. The tall man is back. Oh, do you want to go somewhere else? No, let's just play. Is he scary? Annoyed sigh. No. He just looks at me. He just looks. Yeah, and sometimes he goes down the hall like a hoverboard. Oh, well, okay. How about we go play in the living room? Answer. My younger sister, 12 years younger than me, when she was around 5 yo, once said to me, sometimes someone comes in my room and I think it's you or Dad, but it isn't. I asked who it was, obviously quite alarmed, and she says, I don't know, the gray people. I asked if they ever bothered her or did anything to her, and she said, no, they just come in and then disappear. Story 6. Is Mommy home? I saw her walk by the door. My wife was working nights, and my daughter said she saw her walk by the bedroom door way earlier than she would have been home. I told her maybe it was a fly or something she saw move out of the corner of her eye, but then she said, no, it was this color, and pointed at her arm. The creepy thing is that I had been seeing things out of the corner of my eye a few times that night, but didn't say anything about it. Answer. I was the child this happened to. I remember I was like 6, and all of a sudden I see my grandpa walk by my room and down the hallway and turn into the kitchen. I get all excited thinking he came to visit us, so I run to the kitchen and find only my mom at the table. I ask her where Grandpa went, and she was super confused because he was in Poland and not visiting. I still remember it clear as day. Story 7. I was reading to my niece in her bed once. She was probably around 3. Totally normal. And then she suddenly looked into the corner of the room and said, "Shh, please stop screaming. I can't hear the story." Then back to normal. We finished the book in the living room. Story 8. Where's my other mother? The one that was before you? Said my toddler quizzically while we were playing. That made me break out in goosebumps. Answer. When my daughter was 2.5, she, on her own, talked a lot about her other father. She talked about how he was so nice to her and she really missed him. When we tried to ask if she meant her dad, she would get angry and shout, "No. Daddy is not my other father. Daddy is my parent." When we asked about him, she said he ate red meat, a phrase we never use. He ate red meat and she had macaroni. She asked him for some and he let her have a bit, and it was so good but also yucky. When I asked where he is, she said he fell down and got a really big boo-boo, and she misses him so much. He's so far away, I want to see him again. She was always unusually emotional talking about him, but this last bit she was really upset, so I stopped asking her about it. She would mention it a few more days, then stopped. Story 9. My dad passed after a long, painful struggle with cancer when my son was around 18 months old. I was still grieving a few months later when my son woke from a nap, and I went to his room to get him. When I opened the door, he pointed behind me and said, "Who's that man?" We were alone in the house, but I looked behind me anyway, to see nothing. I said, "What does he look like?" My son answered, "He looks like the sun." A few days later, we were playing on his toy telephone, having pretend conversations. My son passed me the phone and said, "It's Papa." My eyes welled up instantly, and I asked him, "What does he say?" My son paused like he was listening and said, "I love you." Another pause. "I miss you." I'm usually not the type to believe the supernatural, but it really made me believe that he came to say goodbye to us and let us know he was okay. Answer. A similar thing happened in my family. When my brother was 1 or 2, my uncle passed away tragically. He was my mom's best friend. One day, my mom was in the kitchen and heard my brother laughing in the living room. She went in and asked him what he was being so silly about, and he pointed to an area in the room and said, "He's making me laugh." My mom asked who, and he said my uncle's name, as if it were obvious. Maybe 30 years later, my other brother is over my parents' house with his son. It was my mom, dad, brother, nephew, and myself, all in that same living room. My nephew, out of the blue, says my uncle's name. No one else in the family had that name. Saw it with my own eyes. Story 10. When my older daughter was 3, she colored all of her dolls to look like they had been beaten up or cut, and then covered all their eyes with bandages. When I asked her why she did it, she said all her dolls were dead and wanted me to see what he did. The only people watching her at that point were us or my parents, and neither of us have that kind of a household, so I don't know where the hell it came from. Story 11. My son, who was around 7 at the time and my only child, would play in his room and have these vivid conversations. I just brushed it off as imaginary play, but these convos were about our family. One day, out of curiosity, I asked who he was talking to, and he told me his sister that was in heaven came to play with him and described what she looked like. I had just had a miscarriage a few months prior to this happening, and he described a baby girl that would have looked like me. Then, one day he randomly came to me and said, "Mommy, my sister isn't coming back anymore. She says, I have new sister." Coming to play with me creeped me out, but I did find out a week or 2 later I was pregnant, and I ended up having a girl. Edited for clarity. Answer. Dawn. My mom had a stillborn daughter before me, and tells me that when I was 4 or so, we were driving past the hospital in town, and from the back seat, I said, "There's where my sister lives." I'm still not sure if I believe her. Maybe I said something else. Maybe she had told me something about it, I don't know. But this thread and your comment in particular got me feeling all sorts of things. Story 12. When my daughter was born, my 2-year-old son, sweetest guy ever, was holding her, looks at me all serious and goes, "We don't strangle our baby sister." Answer: I think I have an explanation for that one, which is that it's a frequent subject of intrusive thoughts with a baby around. If someone is anxious and they have a baby, they will see themselves in the most horrible scenarios in their mind. Throwing the baby out the window, for example, not because they actually want to do it, but rather as a result of their anxiety. Now, how a 2-year-old would end up with these same thoughts, I don't know. But if there are anxious people around, maybe he picked up on it, and being a 2 years old, he doesn't have the social filter that usually keeps intrusive thoughts hidden and keeps people from realizing just how common they are. And on the contrary, he might feel the need to verbalize the idea to let it out in a way where he has control over it. Anyway, that's just a theory. I'm not a psychologist. Story 13. We have no one in our family who has this name or anything close. No friends. ECT. Our 2IO kept seeing Yaya, Yaya in my room, Yaya there. And the worst, Yaya no like that. Story 14. Kid told me they wanted to cut my face off and wear it because they love me so much. Still have my face. Story 15. Middle of the night, my son comes into my room, stands in the doorway and says, "Are we still playing the game?" Then turns and walks away. I did not sleep the rest of the night. Story 16. Last year, daughter was 6. I was in the bathroom, she was in her bedroom, and I had a sensation of someone walking past the bathroom door, like a shadow passing. Daughter came out her room and said, "Who was that?" I asked what she meant, and she said, "Who was the pretend person who just walked past?" I asked how it was a pretend person, and she said they were all gray, like a shadow but a person. I keep telling myself it was just a weird coincidence. Answer: I had a very similar encounter about 1 to 2 years ago. I went to the bathroom at around 10 p.m. My mother was the only other one in the house at the time. I was just sitting in there, and I hear very apparent footsteps, and I see a shadow moving from under the door while on the toilet. Then they disappeared after a few seconds. I went back to her room and asked her if she got out of bed for something. She said no and asked me why. She was comfy and tucked in bed, so there's no reason she would have been walking around. Story 17. Not as creepy as some I've heard, but when our son was around 2.5, we got a Roomba and he named him Blinky. One day he became very scared of the Roomba, and when I tried to talk to him about it, he told me Blinky sees you. Blinky is always watching. Story 18. When my daughter was 5, she told me a man woke her up and said she had to choose whether to go up, to the sky, or down, to the ground. We are not religious. I told her she could choose to just stay with me instead. Thankfully, he has not presented her with any other ultimatums. Story 19. My 3-year-old won't stop saying there's a ghost in the bathroom, specifically in the bathtub. He loves taking baths, so I don't think he's just afraid of the room tub, but I can't figure out what he's talking about. When he talks about ghosts, he's usually referring to the white sheet over the head. Halloween type of ghost, like he puts a blanket over his head and says, "Mommy, spooky ghost." I've held him up and told him to point to the ghost, but he just points to a corner of the tub with nothing in it. And when I get close to the wall, he says right there, and says he's touching the ghost, but his hand is just suspended in the air, not touching anything. Story 20. When my son was 2, he suddenly had an imaginary friend named Boy. According to him, Boy came home with us from behind the shed at my friend's house. Boy used to play with him. He talked to Boy. We had to set a seat at the table and a spot in the car for Boy. Occasionally, I would ask him where Boy was, and he would say things like, "Oh, he's walking right behind you." Boy eventually went away after more than a year of being around, but my son is 7 now, and if I ask him about Boy, he says he doesn't want to talk about it. Story 21. My daughter was 3, looked up from playing, and at an empty wall, waved and called, "Bye." I got a message about an hour later that my aunt had passed away that afternoon. She was the closest I had to a grandma, but she never met my kids because we lived in different countries. I'm not religious, but still feel like she came to check in on us before going. Story 22. I was having severe, go to the hospital level abdominal pain and nausea during a time I was getting worked up for known gallbladder issues, wondering if I had an obstruction again. It felt just like it did before. I was scared and in agony and dreading moving, even to call for help. Kiddo was 5, had come into my bed without my knowing before I was woken by pain. Out of nowhere, from sound asleep, he goes, "Mommy, you need to stand up now." So I did. It hurt so bad. He was already asleep again. I stood for a minute, and as I did, the pain that was cutting through my core to my spine slowly disappeared. A few minutes later, the nausea went away. I don't know what it was. I didn't fart or anything simple to explain it. Like gas pain. Just gone. I didn't even know he was there till he spoke. My woo-woo brain thinks one of my known stones was stuck, and he helped me clear it somehow. Or maybe it was just a spasms. I'll never know, haha. Story 23. I was putting my daughter to bed when she was around 3, and she said, "Mummy, why did you take so long to be ready for me? I'm glad I picked you to be my mummy, but you made me wait so long." My other daughter, when she was 2, said something like, "I remember when I was your mummy, and other daughter was your brother. That was a long time ago." And has, on more than one occasion, said, "Mummy, when will I see my other mummy again? Creepy little weirdos." Answer. I love this so much. We had a lot of fertility issues and a few losses before finally having my baby. I knew my last IVF transfer worked, like I just knew. And I would talk to her, or thinking to her, and say I was so glad she picked us and how excited all her aunties and uncles would be to meet her. She's a 1.5 years old now, and I just asked her the other day if she picked us to be her parents, and she said yes. Now, whether she is just being a kooky little toddler or something IDK, but it made me feel a little validated, ha ha ha. Story 24. When my daughter was a toddler, she would often cry and point to the dark corner in the hallway at night. Then we moved away from that place when she was almost 4 years old. Years later, we drove by that place, and I asked her if she remembers anything about it. She said she remembers a tall, dark man standing in the corner in the hallway. Story 25. Between maybe 3 to 4 years of age, my daughter had an imaginary friend she called Otro, which we learned much later means other in Spanish. She started using Spanish words from time to time that she said Otro taught her. Story 26. We stayed in an old country house, and for the entire time one of my children kept saying that she lived near here with her first family. For the entire week, she referred to me as her second mom. It was really weird. Never mentioned her first family again after we left. Story 27. Other parent. Okay, but why did you scratch Quinn? Hippie toddler. He didn't have wings to rip off. Context. We had just found out my toddler, both youngest and tallest in his pre-K class, was getting bullied. He scratches the kid. We were expecting that was the reason. Nope, our boy, who literally got thrown off a slide and would not snitch, lost his chute when he saw bully go after a butterfly. Watch the sweet ones. They feel big things too, and less practice holding back when they final snap o. Story 28. On my first international flight, I loudly asked my mum, "Are we disintegrating yet?" instead of descending. 30 years later, it still gets brought up. Story 29. My then 3-year-old was having problems sleeping and said it was because the black flyer thing had been visiting him at night. When asked what it looked like, he basically described a ringwraith-type creature that flew around his room in the dark, and he ended the description with, "He doesn't have eyes, but he can still see you." We let him sleep with his lamp on after that. Story 30. When my eldest was still in diapers, we lived in a house in which one room in particular creeped me out. One morning, I was in that room's closet, sorting out fresh laundry and hanging some clothes. My daughter toddled into the room, and as she walked closer, I knew she needed a diaper change. So I grabbed a little portable mat and diaper supplies from that same closet, and I laid it on the floor, right outside of the closet. She knew the drill. She laid down on the mat, and I started the diaper change. With my back to the closet, on my knees, my body half in, half out of the closet, my daughter starts telling me, "No." I thought I had accidentally pinched her with the diaper tab, so I said, "Oh, no." "I'm so sorry," she says again, more firmly this time. "No." I'm confused, so I start checking to make sure the diaper isn't too tight. She then yells, "No, no, no." I didn't understand what was happening, so I asked, "No, what's wrong?" She then points and says, "Not you, him. Be nice to mommy." I realized that she wasn't pointing at me, but rather behind me. The hair on the back of my neck rose instantly. I picked my daughter up like a football, diaper hanging off, and ran. I imagine I looked like the Heisman Trophy. Every instinct told me to get outside into the sunlight. I don't even remember how I got outside. Anyway, that was one that stands out. Story 31. My daughter did something that kinda wigged me out when she was a toddler. We were visiting my parents. She looked right at a rocking chair, waved, said, "Hi, Huey," and went back to playing. That was my godfather Hugh's rocking chair. He had been dead for over a decade at that point. Story 32. Not my child, but I remember hanging out with a friend of mine when his little brother walked up to him and asked, "Do you remember when I were big and you were little?" Not exactly creepy per se, but it was strange. Story 33. Not my child, 'cause I was the child. I was frequently seeing things as a child. My parents told me once when I was 5 years old, I was sitting on the rug with my Barbies while they watched TV. They said my head snapped up and my eyes went a bit distant before I said, "Someone died in here," while I looked past them. Apparently, I snapped right out of it after a few seconds and went right back to playing. Basically, I was the kid you see in horror movies, LOL. Story 34. Not my child, but at the library I work at, I once heard a 3-year-old with tears in his eyes say to his mom, "I didn't mean to say that, it was just the bad man talking." Story 35. When my son was about 5, we lived in a house that a finished attic where the kid's bedroom was. I was walking behind him up the stairs because we were going to clean. He stopped dead on the steps and turned around to me and had zero color in his face. I asked, "What's wrong, honey?" and he said, "I don't like the souls." Story 36. She was barely 2, and as clear as day she said as we watched a butterfly float by, "Next time I want to come back as that." My jaw dropped. We aren't religious or spiritual, or at least we weren't. I've been questioning everything since. Answer. When I was in 2nd grade, my friend and I were looking at our birthmarks and decided that it probably coincided with how many times we were reincarnated. When I asked my mom about it, she informed me that Catholics don't believe in reincarnation. Then, when I was in college, I was reading a book that mentioned how birthmarks could tell a story of how you died in a past life, and I darn near dropped the book. Story 37. My 3-year-old son, playing in the bath with some PJ Masks figures, held one of them underwater with some force. Good night, Owlette. Good night. Story 38. I've got 3 silly ones. At 14 months old, I had her on my back while we were taking a hike in the remote hilled woods near my mom's house. My daughter, who could maybe string together 2 words at the time, started repeatedly saying, "bear." Luckily, there was no bear. At 18 months, we were taking a walk through our neighborhood and went past the forested edge. My daughter pointed out into the woods and said, "Hiding people. Hiding peeping people." We chuckled nervously. At around 2.5 years old, we took my daughter out on a night walk in the neighborhood. We do these pretty frequently. She enjoys them. We rounded the bend from our house and were chatting when our daughter started to interrupt us. She pointed into the distant street and said, "Doggies, doggies." We looked and couldn't see anything, just quiet, still darkness. "I see doggies there. But they are not doggies, and they are running here fast, and they are scary." Okay, no doubt that one scared us, and we scooped her up and skedaddled back to the house. Edit. I forgot one more. My daughter and I were sleeping at my parents' old house, which was an interesting place, to say the least. In the middle of the night, I hear my 2-year-old start grumbling and then say, "Pretend there's ghost. Pretend there's ghost." More whining and grumbling, not pretend. Silence for a bit. I get out. Believe it or not, this was one of the most chill incidents at that house, so I just chuckled and went back to sleep. Story 39. We were a